talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Pretty good. You?
I'm good. I'm really excited about our guest today, Frank. This guy, I've known him for a long time. I've known him since my very earliest memories of my time in the IAM industry. And Frank is a true thought leader, not only in IAM, but also in how to fend off allergies. He used to give me some great advice on how to not die from allergies in allergy season, and he knows his stuff. You know, Frank's also, I'd say he's a OG in the IAM industry. He's my mentor and he's my friend. One of my earliest memories in IAM was a lunch date that we had. I was at Ingersoll Rand at the time. It was my CIO, who was my boss, and another friend of mine from the company, and Gordon Eubanks and Tom Neckel and Frank. And they were the posse from Obelix. And, you know, Gordon Eubanks, a real legend in this industry. And, you know, hopefully Frank can just kind of reminisce on his times with Gordon. But I thought that was just, you know, one of my most memorable moments in my career. And also just, you know, days all the way back to my early days with Frank. Frank recruited me to Identropy. He coined a lot of really cool catchphrases like cows moo, and he was the driving force behind the Identropy culture. And the Identropy culture, if you know Identropy, that's kind of what we center our company on, is making it a great place to work and really having a strong corporate culture. In addition, while Frank was at Identropy, he built an identity as a service product called Squid Lifecycle. That was a true passion of his, and something that I think very few people get an opportunity to do in their career, which is kind of build a product like at that level. So really excited that we have Frank here today, and just want to welcome him to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jim. What an honor. Thank you for that introduction. It's humbling, and you know, he brings a lot of memories. Do you remember, Jim, that in that lunch, I think we carpool, and I was in the backseat of your car, and then I asked you if you own a dog, and then you said, "Well, that's very observant of you." And then it turns out that it was a whole bunch of hair in the backseat where I was sitting.
Very observant of you. What would make you think that now that you're covered in dog hair?
That definitely gave me something to think about in terms of allergies, for sure.
Well, Frank, thanks for joining us. We certainly appreciate it. I know we're going to be talking about sort of the balance of convenience and security, which is something that I know that you're passionate about, and we'll get into that. Before we get too far along, though, I do want to mention an upcoming webinar that is going to be interesting for everybody in the identity space. It's called Hacking Identity, the Good, Bad, and Ugly of Identity-Centric Security Controls. That's a mouthful. With the IDSA, ID Security Defined Alliance, and Jared Brennan from SailPoint. And I mentioned that because Jared's actually going to be a guest of ours next week. So hopefully you guys will check that out. And it'll be on September 3rd at noon Eastern time. You can find more information on it at the idsalliance.org website. So I want to give people a shout out for that before we dive into things here with Frank. Our traditional first question, Frank, how did you get into identity and access management? Why don't we start there?
Yeah, by the way, I must confess, I have prepared for this because I listened to some of your episodes. So I sort of thought about how I would answer that question. And I know, Jeff, that I believe you keep tallies on where people end up. So whether you found it or it found you, it certainly found me. It was an accident. My story is, I'm not going to necessarily give dates, but I'll tell you that way back when I used to work at Sun Microsystems, there was this product called Sun Internet Mail Service or Server, Internet Mail Services. SIMS was the acronym. And this was a revolutionary new email server that was taking over the enterprise at the time. And at the heart of it was this new technology. It was up and coming called LDAP that allowed it to do very fast processing, quick resolutions of email addresses to different mailboxes and so forth. And so I became really enamored by that technology and became obsessed. And so I started to learn and overnight became an LDAP expert. And little did I know that that was going to be the start of my journey. And so fast forward a few years, maybe you could say a few decades, and here I am, still very proud and passionate about the identity space. I always found that there's a parallel that I used to say. That is, everybody talks about Steve Jobs and Apple at the convergence of technology and humanities and liberal arts and how that inspires design, etc. I feel that identity is also at a frontier, is the convergence of access to systems and people who need access to those systems. And so for as long as there will be humans needing access to systems, there will be a job for someone in identity.
I totally agree. And I like identity because it's one of the areas where there's a pretty good history on it, right? And a lot of different technologies. But I joined it really kind of in the ops perspective because at the time security was kind of seen as the no group, right? It was like, oh, firewall, no, can't do that. That's going to cause a problem. Whereas identity was more along the lines of figuring out how to solve the business needs, right? We know these applications are coming in. You have to give people access to it. How can we do it securely in addition to efficiently and with a good user experience, et cetera? So I'm excited to have a conversation with you around the user experience because I'm a big believer in a good product, whether it's internal or external, and it hasn't always been that way. So I know we're going to get into that, and that's really where I get really super interested in, especially on the identity side, is that user experience.
Yeah, when I first met Frank, he was with the company Obelix, which later became Oracle Access Manager. I think Frank, you ended up moving over to Oracle as part of that transition. But at the time, I was thinking about access management, single sign-on, and I think it was Tom who made the statement, "It's all about the identity." And it was like that was the early thinking of it's not just this single sign-on function. It's not just username and password. It's the identity, and that was leading thought at the time. I mean, I think we take some of those early points for granted now. It's like we take governance for granted now, but those weren't things that were talked about a lot back then.
Correct, Jim. And that's, back in the day, I would say that identity as a space divided along those two lines. And there were people who really specialized and had expertise in the access, authentication, authorization, a little bit more of the runtime, what happens when the user is clicking. And then there was the other camp, which I would say I belong to, and Obelix altogether really differentiated on, was the identity management. So how you come to be in, how do you get represented in the digital space, and what processes need to occur to make sure that you're properly set up before you show up in front, the front door. And so it was an interesting, time, because there were companies that specialized in one space and they were quite successful, like Integrity as an example. And then there were companies that specialized in the other problem, and you almost always needed to have a combination of the two, and then integration of the two became quite challenging.
I think another thought, Frank, was that, again, the kind of that 15, 16 years ago, you just took it for granted that the way to get into a system was you type your username and password. And I don't even think it occurred to us at the time that was how broken that model was. And now we see how broken that model is. And I mean, one of the things I love about our industry is the conferences. One of the earliest conferences I was at was Digital ID World. And, it's kind of like such a forward-looking industry. And it's one of those industries where new innovations are constantly happening and new companies are coming onto the scene and they're bringing new technologies. But it's been, over 10 years that people have been making the statement that passwords are dead. I know you're working on a blog titled eradicating passwords. And I know if you're doing it, it's not just you're not just talking about it, right? You got a game plan. So maybe talk to us a little bit about why you think it's so important to eradicate passwords, and then what you're going to do about it.
Yeah, thank you. And this is sort of I'll say a progression. Maybe let me context set a little bit here, Jim, because my journey has been quite interesting. So I started as an engineer. I worked in sales. By the time you and I met, I was in fact working at Obelix, and I had a combination of implementation / consulting / sales role. It was a hybrid, and so I was very customer facing. And it was really more around what happened once you are trying to deploy the product, the technology to solve a problem. But then, as I progressed, I moved into product management, and then I started to look at the problem from a different point of view. I was very much involved in the customer advisory boards, for example, at Oracle. And so that gave me a perspective of the entire life cycle of the technology, but more importantly, how does that work in the eyes of the customer? And what became clear to me is that we almost started to focus on the wrong areas, or we focused too much on certain areas of the problem. And then I would say we accepted certain deficiencies as just the way they are. And in my retrospective view now, I'll say I would do that slightly different. UX is not something that an identity practitioner should say, well, I don't know much about. Sorry, that's not my area. In fact, that to me sounds more like an excuse. We should have taken this by the horns early on, and then apply UX principles to everything we're trying to do in identity. And so, to give you an example, part of what I've been evangelizing both here at ADP and in the industry. I've spoken at the Identiverse about passwordless and how we can get there. Way before FIDO really had all these milestones that they have now achieved. But the point is, I almost have to really change the mindset. We have to embrace this discipline of thinking with empathy. We're thinking about the user and how the user struggles or succeeds in their interactions. And identity is just an enabling step to get to the user to a destination. So it's not a destination in itself. It needs to come in and out quickly. And so I look at ways to communicate this. And one metaphor I normally use is this thing. I coined at ADP a phrase or a name for a disease called passworditis. And so passworditis is this disease that you can get if you abuse. Your life is consumed by forgetting and remembering and trying to guess passwords so you can get to the systems you need. And so a proliferation of passwords is an explosion of this passworditis. And some of the side effects include that your passwords most likely get compromised and stolen, and then therefore they will be replayed and you will be a victim of identity theft and so forth. And it's been really, really useful to explain it in this sense, so that both folks that live in and out in the identity space, but also folks that are outside of the identity space can understand the pain point and the metaphoric connotation of passwords. And now, more recently, I would say that passwords become the herpes of the identity space. All right. So if you if you for a moment pause, for this metaphor is quite powerful. When you think about this, when you think about herpes, they basically exist. You learn to live with them. You accept them. You know that if your immune system is a little low, then they would explode, and you see rashes and things like that. But it's just the way it is, And so I think the same goes with the way we think about passwords. We just accept them for what they are, live with the consequences and the side effects of having them, but we haven't frontally attacked them and realized that they just need to go. They actually do a lot more harm than they do good. In that, in the world of today, there is no excuse to continue to rely on it. Some of our developers, I say, if you're building a new application, do not spend any time whatsoever in any part of the application developing capabilities to manage passwords, and then forgot password, and then you have to do QA in pen testing and all of those things around the password functionality. Save up all of that development cycle and apply it to making the product experience better, and just enable your application to accept, say, a SAML or an OpenID and OAuth token, and let the authentication problem be solved some other way. But that is a mindset change. The technology already exists. Many of us are just programmed to take this for granted. The passwords are here to stay, and that's the only way it is.
Well, Frank, I think you just topped Cal's moo.
Just...
Password for like herpes. Yeah, that's classic right there.
Yeah. I honestly, you think about the powerful, right? Whenever you get a herpes or something like that, you would realize, oh, Frank just said something about that. Anyway, but you asked me, another part of what you asked me in the question there is, what am I doing? And for us, this is quite fundamental. One of the things, like I was saying, I started my career in implementation, sales, and engineering, moving to product management. And right at the time of Identropy, I pivoted into cloud and more of an identity service provider. IDaaS was the term we used, identity as a service. At ADP, my team manages a platform that enables access and identity for our external facing products. So it's quite large operation, north of 40 million identities. And if you know anything about ADP, we pay 1 in 6 workers in the US. And so we cannot afford to be down. We're obviously a target for anything that goes awry in the internet. And so we have to constantly be looking at, how we keep ahead of the bad guys. How do we enhance the experience for the good guys? And one of the things we found is, I can give you a lot of very, very deterministic data as to how problematic this is. When you think about, quantifiable, say, development hours that go into enhancing password policies or enforcing different password complexities and dictionaries, and then testing and then auditing, and all of that time that we could just literally just wipe out and reinvest into more value creation within the platform. Then look at the cost of just password calls, password support. And, we have been in a journey for the last 5 years where almost everybody in the team is staring at a dashboard that talks about the costs and the trend of all those password calls, so that we can see them go down to zero. Now, over the last few years, we've done some experiments internally. And so passwordless isn't just something we're talking about, it's something we're actually doing. So from our perspective, if you deprogram yourself from this notion that passwords need to exist and that you need them to manage access or establish who someone is, you can start then looking at it in a different way. First, for example, for us, federated access is a way to eliminate passwords. So we don't have to worry about authenticating users if we trust someone else doing that. And whether they use passwords or not to authenticate, that's no longer our problem. We agree to trust that authentication and allow the user in. And so right by investing in making the federation experience better, more integrated, more secure, we eliminate passwords. And we've seen that every time in our world, we federate a client, we are looking at something in the vicinity of 65 to 70% password call volume reduction, just like that. But in addition to that, Jim, we manage a number of different personas. And so some of them require a financial grade assurance because it's related to either your own pay or payroll in general or healthcare, very sensitive information. But there are other levels of assurance that we manage. And so candidates, for example, people looking for jobs, do not require the same level of assurance. And so we have done experiments with that demographic here at ADP. And so we have offer various flavors of passwordless options. Today, in our recruiting platforms, candidates don't have to register. They simply use either their preferred social credential, like LinkedIn or Facebook or Gmail, or we give an option to have a one-time password be sent to them on a channel that they register with, and that is passwordless right in there. And so we have seen the effects of all of this. So some of our interesting findings, some of this non-intuitive, not that intuitive to me at least, is that when you put, I don't know if you've seen that show, it was Man versus something. There was a show on Discovery Channel, is Man versus Bear, Man versus Dolphin, or whatever. So here we have social media or social credentials versus one-time passwords. And let me tell you that based on our experience, one-time passwords win by a landslide. People who prefer them, at least in our experience, to the tune of about 90% of the time. And it has been very, very interesting. So based on that experience, we've polished and we tuned the user experience, and we're now bringing passwordless more and more into the higher assurance levels of the personas that we protect. And so now we're exploring at employee level access and continuing to bring that discipline of, let's experiment, let's measure, and then go forward. But let me tell you, passwordless is a reality. It's no longer a technology question, in my opinion. It's really a mindset change.
So you mentioned that it's not a technology issue. And I think there's a lot of organizations that want to go passwordless, but are stuck maybe in this mode of multiple applications that are not connecting to, any type of shared authentication system or anything like that. And it probably took some time to get to the state where you're at right now, where you're actually able to reap the benefits of the one-time passwords and passwordless type approach. How long did it take you to set the organization up to be where you are today?
Yeah, good question. And to be honest, Jeff, this you're right. This was not something that happened overnight. We actually had to spend a lot of time doing all the preparing, really, all the different maturity levels that we needed to reach, say our UX research, our UX design, all of our methodologies to make sure that we incorporated that into the process. And then at the same time, a significant amount of time went into evangelizing, getting buy-in. This is not something that people are used to or easily absorb, and so we had to evangelize. So a lot of that, and it has taken a few years. I'll say north of 3 years for us to get to the point we're in now, where the blog I published, by the way, I published it last week internally. It's called "The Password is Dead, Long Live the Person," and it goes through this journey that we went through and how I see it. I see it now. I think the final step in this journey, the milestone that convinced me that it's just literally a matter of mindset change and I'll say breaking out or eradicating inertia, is when FIDO 2.0 came out and web authentication became basically a standard that is now widely used. The browsers, and I think early this year we saw the announcement from Apple that they'll support FIDO in their devices as well. And so to me, that is just a declaration that we were hoping would come at some point to declare them dead. So now it's upon all of us to take the action to do it. It's the antidote exists. Let's just make use of it now.
Frank, you mentioned people having a affinity toward one-time passwords, and they're ubiquitous, right? I mean, it's used so often, it's so easy to use. There is some misguidance in terms of it's maybe not the most secure out-of-band way to authenticate somebody, especially compared to authenticator apps and QR codes and the like. You also mentioned a level of assurance kind of mindset or framework. And I'm wondering, do you, in your mind, organize it in that way that one-time passwords are good enough for certain populations, yet other populations are going to force this more, I don't want to call it heavy-handed, but more secure way of doing things?
Yeah, so we've been thinking about this in a more, I'll say, granular way. So we use assurance, and we actually follow the NIST 863 guidelines as much as we can to kind of divvy up the world. But even within the assurance levels, Jim, there are, I'll say nuances and different granularities. So a one-time code sent to a text, via text to a cell phone is far more secure than one sent to an email. We can go into the details that would support that claim, but it's a one-time code and is a factor of authentication, but they're not necessarily standing at the same footing when it comes to assurance. You mentioned QR code, authenticators, et cetera. And some of them, again, have different degrees of assurance, but also different levels of friction to the end user. We did a study, UX, I remember our designers, it was a very interesting study. We had come up with a QR code authentication flow that would marry the device to the browser. And this is going back 4 years. We even had a patent on that design. I think that patent, it's still pending. But the point there is we were very proud of that innovation. We then decided to put it through the test. And we found something very interesting. We found that people would still prefer a one-time code over the QR code experience because the effort required for a frequent user to go pull out their phone, line it up in the screen in front of the browser, scan the code, and then touch on their screen whatever they needed to say the biometric authentication or whatnot, was far greater than just getting the code and typing it in. And so we learned that usability, UX informed us that wasn't going to be a winner, and we put that in the back burner. Same goes for other types of authentication. So the UX discipline in us would force you to test them, compare them, figure out which ones work for what type of user, and then you can optimize even within the same level of assurance.
I think that you brought out one topic earlier, Frank, which I wanted to touch on. I didn't want to let it fly by too much without picking on it a little bit, because you talked about the password and the idea that people were these chronic resetters of passwords. And I've worked for a company that is an ADP customer for a long time. And so I've accessed ADP portals. And I think that one of the things maybe ADP has recognized is that we have to have strong password policies, right? We can't let you just use a weak password. And so we're going to have a strong policy. And therefore, something like we remember your last 26 passwords. And of course, it's not the same password not on the same cycle that my corporate network password is on. So it's different. I forget it every time if I'm not using a password save. So I've become one of those chronic resetters. But I guess the point I'm trying to point out here is that there's a tug of war between going with a weak password policy that people will remember, or going with a strong password policy, and then people become chronic resetters. And really, is your security any better? So the bottom line is there's like no way to make the password really that strong.
Yeah, this is a lose-lose, Jim. And like I said, the point is that if we continue to perpetuate passwords, we'll always spend and waste time debating these things. I think NIST published, I think it was NIST that they published, just use passphrase. 32 character long passwords that never expire are statistically better than any complex password that you want to enforce on people. And that's it. If you really want to stick to passwords, then go that way and don't waste any more time. But the reality is that you got to really think about the usability spectrum and then look for a pattern that optimizes security and convenience. And then you will find that passwords do not meet that criteria. Now, what is interesting, Jim, to give you another example, beyond passwords, just to get into the point of balancing convenience and security, is we talk about two-factor authentication. And I think people think about, well, if I just deploy two-factor authentication to all of my users, I achieve a great degree of security and I would mitigate all this risk. Yes, correct. You probably will. But at the same time, you're imposing a lot of friction on your end users. Now, it's not only username, password, it's another factor that they have to deal with. So the question is, do you really need to impose two-factor authentication all the time at the beginning of the session? Or are you better off looking for a simpler authentication experience? And then later on in the session, let's say if you need to do something more sensitive, then step up the user. That's still technically two-factor, but the friction is moderated or regulated to when you need it. And then another discussion we're having internally, and again, I'll maybe turn this into a question for you guys, is that I think the industry has been trained to think about two-factor always as in something you do during login, at the beginning of your session, and always password first and then another factor, okay? And then in some cases you say, well, password first, then let's do some risk check. Is this a device that we know? Maybe this is something we remember, and then decide whether or not to have the second factor. But it's always password first, some evaluation in the middle, and then another factor. I submit to everyone, and if you want to, go through the UX research, et cetera, please do. But if you just simply take that equation and reverse the order, where the first step is a passwordless channel, passwordless method, already most likely is going to have a higher assurance that passwords, pretty much anything is more secure than a password anyway. And then the risk check that you would do in the middle most likely will result in not needing that second step or that second factor. And so you end up effectively in a passwordless experience for everybody.
So now let's get really radical and talk about, on top of that, maybe even continuous authentication, right? Keyboard dynamics, or keyboard stroke, however what phraseology you want to use for it. I think it's interesting to talk about how someone logs in, because the process is password then MFA. If you don't have a password, and you are using a passwordless experience, by default, it may also already be password, or may already be multi-factor, because if you're getting a one-time password via SMS to your phone, you probably had your phone locked, which meant you used either, Touch ID, Face ID, the Android equivalents, to log into that. So you proved who you are to get the, password that you would need then to log in. So it's already covering both of those. I think the question then becomes, how far do you take that authentication? Is it, like you said, at the very beginning, and then that's it, and then your session's good for however many minutes, hours, right? You define, or do you want to incorporate things like continuous authentication to help make sure that the person logged in is still the logged in, is still the person that they think they are? Any thoughts on continuous authentication?
Yeah, I think continuous authentication is an example of improving security and convenience right there, Jeff, because you will look for ways to minimize friction if you don't need to apply that friction, and then apply it when you feel you need it. I think that's doing, here you have the machine or the computer doing the effort and not the end user. And so that to me is the right equation. I think continuous authentication, without overloading the term, is a good area for us to optimize for. But there are other areas, so we obviously spent a lot of time here talking about passwords and authentication. But if you were to look at other aspects of the identity lifecycle, like, for example, verifying someone's identity during registration, there are other possibilities to make the process, again, more secure and more convenient. We've done experiments in this space too. And, one of the experiments that I presented at Identiverse a couple of years ago is a partnership we have with another bank, with a partner bank of ADP. And so in this equation, if you happen to have an account with that bank, during registration into our system, we allow you to authorize that bank to verify your identity on your behalf. And so you can sign in with that bank credential that you probably know because you use it every day, allow them to then vet the identity information we need to complete the process. And you complete it within 30 seconds as opposed to say 6 clicks or so. And so the way to think about this, so continuous authentication, and two-factor authentication, et cetera, is to always push for how can you improve convenience and security on behalf of that end user. And so that the effort is done mostly by the computer and less so by the end user. I don't know if I answer your question, Jeff, or actually just butcher it altogether.
No, absolutely. And I think it goes right into that consumer mindset, right? When it comes to identity and access management, the user experience needs to be good because, like, water around a rock, people are going to find a way to get around poor experiences as much as they can, and ultimately that drives up risk and down the security posture of an organization. So when we talk about consumer mindset, it's not necessarily external consumers, but it's also your internal workforce, right? They use your services just as much, if not more, than maybe external users as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's empathy at the same time. So, you might have use cases. I'll give you a very classic use case for us. You have clocks. If you go through, say, a restaurant or a place where people are, hourly workers, there's typically going to be a clock where they punch in, punch out. If you have to authenticate and you need two-factor every time that happens, you're adding friction, literally taking time, productivity time out of that worker so they can log in and punch. You want that to be secure, but very convenient, very frictionless. And so biometrics fits the bill in that case.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that would be the most frustrating elements of a user experience from a consumer standpoint is if you hit a dead end, something where, now I have to pick up the phone and call somebody, or I need to pull somebody in for assistance. So I think, self-service is a critical area of that consumer mindset. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think we all should, the line between consumer and enterprise, in my mind, get very blurry, and so the idea of bringing concepts that work in the consumer space into the enterprise makes perfect sense to me. Again, another effort to bring more convenience, not necessarily at the expense of security, into the enterprise.
Yeah, and a big driving force right now is also, privacy and consent. And I'm imagining that at ADP, this is front and center with everything you do. How do you, manage that process and make it so that the consumer feels, again, I think it's a balance of convenience and security, but also I make this analogy a lot. If I go to a bank and they don't have multi-factor authentication, sure, I'm expecting multi-factor authentication from my bank. And if you don't have that, I'm thinking you're not going to be very secure with my data. From a privacy consent standpoint, I feel like if you don't have some way for me to manage my privacy settings so that they're transparent and it's not, read this 10-page document to understand our privacy statement. So I'm wondering kind of what your thoughts are there in terms of applying this consumer mindset to privacy consent, and how can practitioners who are listening kind of take that into account with their projects?
Good question, Jim. And this is interesting. I in preparation to this recording, this session with you guys, I actually listened to the episode with Eve Maller on this very topic, consent. I think it was user managed access, and it was very, very, in my opinion, it was a very good discussion on the virtues of doing that up front. I think, Jim, it's not only that you have to comply. As a provider, you have certain regulations, certain liability for protecting the data that you're the custodian of, and you have to earn the trust. But I think it's also about transparency. So what kind of relationship do you want to have with the end user? So in today's world, if you manage anything that's sensitive, any information that's sensitive to the end user, you have an obligation to be transparent about that. And to the extent that you can, then give that end user the ability to manage, to dictate, to be smart about how they want to consent or not. And so, if I recall correctly, I think that what stuck with me from your discussion with Eve was that she said, approach it in a similar way as you would approach the authorization problem, And I feel like that's the right mindset here. So consent is nothing but another means to authorize something to take place. And you want to inform the party that's making the authorization decision of what they're authorizing so they can make it. Now, I'll tell you, consent, privacy, and all this framework is, in my opinion, something that's fast evolving. And so if you hardwire this into your application, then it would be really hard for you to make it more flexible as the frameworks continue to evolve. We have GDPR, and then there's the California Privacy Act, and then now you have TCPA, and you have the biometrics regulation in Illinois and other states. And so this is really bound to evolve. And so either by regulation or by use case, you have to think about consent as a dynamic framework that you need to factor into your experience and make sure that you are transparent to the end user so you can maintain trust, you can gain trust.
So with all of these different privacy concerns, laws, regulations, et cetera, and trying to manage this, across your different services, whether they're on-prem or cloud, or even some type of hybrid approach, how do you approach this from a technology perspective when it comes to finding the right technology fits to achieve these goals, but keeping all that in mind?
Right. I think, Jeff, it's not an easy question. I'll say let's look for first degree principles that perhaps have been proven over time that can help us tackle a complex problem like that. One would be to make sure that some of these core functions are not hardwired into your applications, but that can be externalized. And so whether you're developing or you're implementing a technology from a third party, you want to make sure that those applications, those platforms have the ability to externalize identity. And that gives you an opportunity to now layer in different frameworks. So you can have different authentication experiences that essentially are completely external from the application. So the application doesn't have to change. Similarly, you could apply the same principle to how you manage consent. Do you invoke this at the point in which you're about to make a transaction, or allow the user to make a transaction? Do you do this upfront when the person just first registers? You have to think through that. But the idea is that by externalizing some of this capability, some of this functionality, you have a better opportunity to handle them and handle them in a go forward basis. Because as you know, these frameworks are bound to change, bound to evolve, and you don't want to be hardwiring this into every platform that you manage or you have to integrate.
I guess you take that into account every time you think about, okay, do we buy or build a technology? I think when it comes to a lot of the passwordless technologies, it would be insane to try to, for an individual company that's not in the business of identity and access management, to try to build a passwordless technology, right? Is something that you'd want to look for a cloud-based service if possible.
Yeah, I mean, there are many, I would say, that's sometimes somewhat philosophical, Jim. There are arguments in favor and against, but I think the principle is still holding, and that is, you externalize the function, and now that function can be hosted in the cloud, can be hosted on premise, or in a hybrid environment. But you're right in that, it doesn't make sense. I'll say in many cases, it's just commodity in a way that, you don't have to build the authentication technology. You can just plug it in. An example with the smartphones supporting biometrics so commonly and so vastly available out there, you can just simply pivot on the mobile device to provide two-factor or passwordless login into your application. And that simplifies a lot of, you don't need a whole lot of technology to implement a push notification or a text message OTP. You can actually develop a lot if you needed to. But the point is that you're externalizing the capability. You're plugging that into the app. It's not hardwired.
So when it comes to the end, I'm a big fan of the smartphone as an authentication factor. But one of the challenges that I see with that is this mindset of not necessarily on the customer side, but more on the internal side of things, employees, et cetera, where there's this thought process that, well, if a company is making me use my cell phone to authenticate, then they should pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
Have you come across that? Do you have thoughts about that? right, wrong, and different. What do you think?
So, Jeff, this is a very interesting point. And yes, we come across, as a matter of fact, there are labor laws, I think, in the state of California that actually make this a bargaining point in labor related negotiations. So I've been firsthand involved in situations where workers would say, well, if you require me to have a cell phone so that I can do my job, then you may as well just pay for it, right? Which is it's absolutely valid. So there is that argument that therefore you have to offer other options. So that's a very real scenario. But we also did some research, and what is interesting is this, so at some point we were faced with that constraint. So you cannot assume that you can use the person's mobile device to do authentication. So we went out and we did research, and so just to find out what is the feasibility of assuming that a cell phone will be available, and what's the likelihood of someone would consent to using it for this purpose. And it turns out is overwhelmingly positive in that sense. So we found that most people, so here's an interesting study. We found that most people not only have a cell phone that they're willing to use for this type of scenarios, but in many cases, they have more than one. They may have one for their work and one personal. And if they ever leave the house, this is interesting. If you ever leave the house, say en route to your office, and you realize you forgot your phone, you will immediately go back and pick it up and return. But if you actually forgot your wallet, you will still make it without your wallet. So that is how powerful the affinity between the person and the device is today. Now, when it comes to, is this something that the person can opt in? What we found through our research is that, most people would opt in because they see it as a benefit. And so it gets a little blurry because in the context of enterprise, you have to deal with, perhaps regulation, legislation that could be interesting in terms of, what you're, as an employer, enforcing and what's your obligation. But the reality is that if you interrogate the end users, there's more willingness to do it. So maybe there is a compromise that can be drawn.
So Frank, I find it fascinating that you're able to go out and do all this research and kind of come back with this data. I'm sure that helps you in making an ROI case for the investments. Company like ADP, when you're making IM investments, they're huge, right? They're in terms of dollars. So you have to be able to come back and show a return on investment. And I'm wondering if you could kind of share your approach to that. Is it just, hey, when you talk about the user experience and improving the user experience, your leadership kind of gets it? Or are you still having to make the show that, these dollars are going to return additional dollars in sales or things like that?
So it's been a maturity curve for us, Jim. You're right. And by the way, I would say that's another function or another part of the job that we have to master. And I would say that's true for any practitioner. You have to think about the business side. What's the ROI? What's the business outcome of what you're doing, so that can justify the investment in the technology. But we talked earlier about the pass for call volume. So we have very specific metrics as to how much that costs, and so it's very easy to quantify that. But there are other metrics, Jim. We look at things like abandonment or conversions, and you can easily extrapolate the potential revenue, the potential added benefit in user satisfaction, things that can be measured when you improve. And so we have, over the years, really learned to focus on those and show them as our objectives, as our outcomes that drive the investment. Obviously, in security, you also have the card of, well, if something bad happens, right? If you have an audit or a liability or a fraud case, then you have to react, and that is also another way that you can position your investment. The reality is, I prefer to be on the side of, let's do this proactively in a way that creates value, as opposed to reactively because we have to plug something that was catastrophic or an incident or something like that. And so even with fraud, we are looking at the effect of two-factor in reducing overall fraud. And so the incidence of cases relative to the adoption of Step Up, it's something that we can correlate and then justify additional investments in Step Up, as an example. I think we all have to spend time as practitioners in this space because you can't just simply ask for funding to continue to roll out technologies that may or may not necessarily contribute to more security or more convenience. You have to have numbers to really make that argument.
I couldn't agree more. And I know you've been most generous with your time. Before we wrap up here, is there anything else that you'd like to kind of throw out there for folks who are listening, especially if they're kind of considering passwordless, how they can maybe get started if they're looking to start that journey?
Yeah. So my thinking overall, and this is, a journey that has taken, like I said, a couple of decades at least, is that when you come through the identity space, you normally start at a technology-centric point, either as an engineer, as a standard, or some sort of technology, entry point into the domain. But we all have to spend our time graduating and learning about UX. And so I think that a lot of us have, room to grow. I'll put myself in that category, that this to me came late in my career. I'll say over the last maybe, 5-6 years is when I would properly speak about UX in the terms that I think I do now. And if I had a recommendation to my colleagues in the industry is make sure that you spend the time understanding UX. How do you do research? What's a usability versus a concept research? And apply that intrinsically to what you're doing. Always think about the user experience. Think about this from the perspective of the end user.
Keep it simple.
Yeah, very thought-provoking.
Jim, anything else that you want to bring up before we call it for this week?
So, Frank, I've mentioned your one of your catchphrases, "Cows moo," and I'm sure I know there are plenty of others, and some of them are not fit for young ears. But maybe you can give everyone, what is "Cows moo"?
Well, "Cows moo" was a phrase we used at some point in I think it was in an advisory engagement at Identropy a few years back, that we were talking about how vendors would solve certain problems and how certain technologies are used to attack problems, but then they lock you in. They basically force you to now, okay, you have to stay with that vendor platform, et cetera. And so what we were telling customers is, look, you don't want to take a vendor and replace your identity strategy with the vendor strategy. That is not going to happen. And then come back and complain that, well, the experience, or we have this, we didn't realize our outcomes, or it didn't quite fit our business model because cows moo. And so that, vendors do what they have to do, but they don't need to understand your business. And so it was sort of a metaphor to explain that, if you leave things for what they are, you may not end up in the space you want, because they by nature would do what they are accustomed to. And so it's hard to break a habit. And I think it's important in that scenario we were talking about, it's important that you take ownership. And cows moo. Vendors are going to do what they do. They want to obviously make you successful with their platform, but it doesn't mean you have to surrender your ownership of the direction and strategy.
Cows moo. Passwords of the herpes identity space. I think that's my favorite one so far. That might be the teaser.
There is one that made me very famous at Identropy, and like Jim said, I can't really say it, for a PG-13. But there is this movie, Pulp Fiction, Quentin Tarantino's movie, probably yours. And then there is this character called Mr. Wolf, Winston Wolf, and that scene where he comes in to rescue the bad guys has a very interesting line that I use a lot at Identropy. And it was sort of, the intent was, don't go celebrate victory or declare victory too early. You be quiet, be very patient before you celebrate. So because the actual phrase was so offensive, we just shortened it to say Mr. Wolf. So we all knew what we were talking about.
Yeah, we had to have clean versions of a lot of things. So a lot of the culture lines were like GSD. The clean version was get stuff done. You can probably, everybody out there knows what it really means, but we don't have to say it here. But that's one of the things, Frank, that you've really brought. And I wonder, Have you kept that passion for corporate culture? I mean, is that something that you're still trying to drive even at ADP?
Yeah. In fact, Jim, I think that if anything, I've gotten a little more comfortable with that. To the degree I was telling you that I spent a lot of my time evangelizing. So I'll share this anecdote within ADP. We have this annual conference that we do every year. It's for ADP executives across the globe. In every area then gets a slot about, it's like a TED Talk. Think about that as a TED Talk, where everybody gets like 15 minutes to talk about their area, their vision, the success or their future plans and so on. And so last October was my turn. I was given the opportunity to present. So I was thinking hard about how to do this. And my topic was breaking up with passwords. That's the name of the slot. And so, you couldn't have picked a most boring topic for anyone to talk about. But what I decided to do is I wrote a sketch and I hire improv actors. And so we deliver this presentation where I'm speaking as if I'm doing a corporate presentation. And then all of a sudden I get hijacked and the thing goes awry. And it was a comedy sketch. And the plot was that, people create passwords based on people that they remember. And so my password was Rosita123, which was my high school girlfriend's name. And so she was in the audience and she was saying, "You cannot break up with me." And that sketch was extremely funny to the degree that now everybody talks about, when I'm giving any presentation at ADP, people ask me, "Is Rosita coming with you?"
So creative.
If we ever get back to something in person, I think you should probably pitch that to the folks over at Identiverse maybe for the next on-site conference as one of the keynotes. I know that would be a lot more interesting than maybe some of the drier talks that we're probably both familiar with.
Good suggestion.
With that, I think we're going to go ahead and close it out for this week. Frank, really appreciate your time, and very happy you're able to carve some out and talk with Jim and I. Where can folks get a hold of you? Open on LinkedIn, or do you have some other mechanism if people want to reach out and chat with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is perhaps the easiest. I'm very active, and I try to be, I would say, accessible and connected to the industry. And so you can definitely reach out to me that way. Probably the best social channel for me.
Frank, are you going to publish the blog, Eradicating Passwords, anywhere that people who are listening could access it at some point?
That's a good suggestion, Jim. The content has to be curated to make sure that I don't reveal anything that would be sensitive to ADP. But let me think about that, and maybe I'll post the essence of it, because just to give you a sense of, I have the blog right in front of me, and I'll just read to you that the opening line makes a reference to Nietzsche, the philosopher, German philosopher, and talked about how in existentialism, you have to elevate as a human. And so that is the opening line for the blog. We have to understand that healing the password actually elevates us as humans. But so there's a lot of content here that I think can be reposted. So I have to think about that. Maybe that's a good challenge.
That's probably another reason to connect with Frank on LinkedIn, because I'm sure you'll post something there if and when that comes out for public consumption, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And what I'll do is in the show notes, I'll put a link to Frank's profile if you want to connect with him, as well as a link to the IDSA presentation or webinar that's happening next week for folks to check out. You can always connect with Jim and I on LinkedIn as well, and we're at identityatthecenter.com, and we're also at IDAC Podcast on Twitter, where we are trying to be more active with that. So with that, we'll go ahead and close it out for this week, and thank everybody for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.